So, the Liberals were really quite wrong about the price tag of the gas plant cancellations. It's $1 billion, all to placate residents in Oakville and Mississauga who didn't want to live near the gas plants, and of course to save Liberal seats in the last election. What does this revelation mean to politics in Ontario? Let's find out. From Martin Regcon, the Queen's Park columnist of the Toronto Star, and welcome back to TVO, Martin.
Thank you.
Well, let's start with this. Is there, in your view, any reasonable defense for the decisions to cancel these two gas plants?
No, for two reasons. Two no's. No, I personally like to go out on a limb sometimes by saying that they should not have even canceled them. I don't live in Oakville and Mississauga. I've never been persuaded by the local NIMBYism, I'm sorry for using that word, it's not an insult, that the plants would have been so harmful to local residents. There are similar gas-fired plants in other big cities around the world. So I always thought that was an exaggerated claim, number one. Number two, no, because it was the wrong time and the wrong way to cancel it in the middle of an election campaign for Mississauga and just about a year before the election campaign for Oakville. So a lot of no's there.
And with the price tag coming in now over $1 billion potentially once it's all added up, what do taxpayers do about this?
Taxpayers, but also ratepayers, remember, because it's going to hit us in the hydro bill. What do we do? That's a good question, because the Auditor General has just told us that it's going to be $1 billion plus or minus. That's not a complete surprise. The Star, I should tell you, was one of the first newspapers back in 2010, the fall of 2010, to speculate. It was an educated guess that it would be about $1 billion to cancel Oakville. And again, we had some information in early 2011 that the government had a report from one of its lawyers that it would be about $1 billion to settle that.
And the opposition Tories have been saying it for 2 years.
Correct. So this is not a complete surprise, but the Auditor General has done good service by, I think, giving us an independent voice, telling us what the numbers are. But the numbers have always been so hard to predict. As she pointed out, most of the difference between her number and the numbers that the government was putting out is based on some fairly complex actuarial assumptions. Is it a 4% financing cost? Is it a 6% financing cost? When will the plants come on stream? That affects how much money you save by a late start and an early start and so on. So the number is there. We have to live with it. What do we do with it? The question is, do we fight another election about the last pre-election promise, or do we take it as it is and move on to other things? I don't think the government should be let off the hook. This is not a case of forgive and forget, but the number is here. The opposition has been clamoring for it for 2 or 3 years, and we've got it. Here we are.
Well, okay, but here's the problem. I'm really trying to sort of help voters understand here. I'm mad about this cancellation. I'm mad about the fact it's costing ratepayers and taxpayers $1 billion. I'm mad at the guy who made the decision, Dalton McGuinty, for what everybody has sort of acknowledged were overtly political reasons, had more to do with political science than actual science. Kathleen Wynne is now in charge. Dalton McGuinty is gone. If I'm a voter, how do I take out my anger on the predecessor on the successor?
That's a good question, because this is Dalton McGuinty's mess, but it's also a Liberal mess, and yes, Kathleen Wynne was part of that cabinet. Everyone wants a scapegoat here. I can't give people comfort here, because I think the reality is there is no one boogeyman who is entirely responsible for this. The biggest share of the blame goes to Dalton McGuinty and his Liberal Party coterie of advisors for canceling it in haste. Mississauga in particular was inexcusable. It was a crass way to do it 2 weeks before voting day in 2011. But let's look at Oakville for a moment, because that's what the Auditor General has just reported on, the second plant. That was canceled a year before the election. So it wasn't done with quite the same recklessness as the Mississauga plant. It was cynical, but not as reckless. They had a year to work it out. They had a very good deputy minister in charge of the energy ministry, not in charge, but running it under a minister. David Lindsay happens to have been Mike Harris's former chief of staff, a Tory. He was largely overseeing, with the minister and the government, those negotiations with TransCanada. McGuinty and others were convinced that they could get, and the correspondence shows us, a good deal with TransCanada. That TransCanada would be reasonable. That's the owner of the builder of the Oakville plant, because they have a lot of interest in Ontario. So they thought they could make it work, and they didn't. The Auditor General and the Legislative Committee have both shown through their work that they screwed up, that the Premier's office screwed up, that the Ontario Power Authority screwed up, The OPA, by the way, is an arm's length organization, ostensibly. It takes direction from the Premier's office and the Energy Ministry. But they also screwed up. They had no idea what the costs were going in and coming out of this.
Well, I gather the idea was in allowing the Ontario Power Authority to make the decision about where those plants should be sited. The idea was, let's take politics out of it. We'll make the decision strictly on the merits. But you can't take politics out of any of this, can you?
Well, I'm glad you raised that, because a lot of people blame the politicians for citing it there in the first place. But the truth is, it was the independent experts, largely at the Ministry of Energy, initially, I think I'm going to mix up Oakville and Mississauga, but one of them, I think Mississauga was cited before the OPA came on stream.
Right.
And Oakville was done through the OPA. So yeah, the politicians were not involved. The experts, not the politicians, not the partisan people, cited it there. And because they privatized this, they allowed private companies to say, I'm going to put it here, or I'm going to put it there, without doing their due diligence. That's a legal term. Let's call it something else. Without meeting people face to face and saying, can you live with a plant here? Okay, there's some NIMBYism here, but is this the right place to put the plant? And they chose two places that were not exactly ideal. They could have put it at Lakeview, the site of the old coal generating plant, and they didn't, for all kinds of political reasons as well. So we can demonize Dalton McGuinty in this if we want, and he bears a lot of the blame. But he's not the only one. There were others who pressured the government to not put it in Lakeview and put it somewhere else, and then to cancel the plant. We know that all three parties asked, or both opposition parties wanted to cancel the plant, and they're now screaming bloody murder about the costs.
Let me follow up on that, because here's what I need to understand. All three parties, Liberals, Conservatives, New Democrats, were promising in that 20 election campaign, if you elect us, we will cancel this plant. The Liberals won. They actually promised to cancel the plant before Election Day in 2011. What I want to know is this. If the Conservatives had won that election, and if Tim Hudak were Premier, and if after the election he made good on his promise made during that campaign to cancel that plant, would we still be where we are with $1 billion of expenditures, but a different guy at the helm?
I think viewers and voters can draw their own conclusions. I think by even the way you frame that question in a very neutral way, you've answered it. The truth is we can't predict how any political party or group of politicians and administrators would have done it any differently. The Auditor General, to her credit, has cataloged, as has the Legislative Committee, something I always called for, a Legislative Committee. Don't think we need a judicial inquiry to get to the root of this. The committee and the auditor have done a good job of showing the paper trail here. And it was a screw-up, and it was a Greek tragedy in the sense of human error, compounding all kinds of other pressures here. Could they have done it differently? You know, I think one of the reasons this has not yet come out, in my view, it's a guess, as a vote-determining issue. I don't think voters believe that a Tim Hudak government or an Andrea Horwath government would have done this dramatically differently. That's not to excuse for 1 minute what the McGuinty Group did. But that's the problem with this kind of a high-pressure political negotiation. McGuinty did worse because he tried to squeeze this. He tried to get it out of the way quickly before the election and after the election. As the Auditor General has pointed out, he wanted this out of the way. He wanted no more maybes. He wanted certainty.
And that
put pressure.
The maybes will kill you.
That's right.
That's what he
and
said.
that'll put pressure on negotiators to screw up. But I don't want to pick on David Lindsay. He was an outstanding public servant and political operator before that. But hey, would he have done differently together with Tim Hudak if he were running the government? I don't know.
Well, Kathleen Wynne has taken responsibility for this. She's apologized for it. She has said, I didn't make the decision to do this, but it's my responsibility to fix it. What's she doing to fix it?
Well, she has said they're going to try to consult better. That's her touchstone, and that they want to get the consultations in at the ground floor instead of later. She has asked the public service to set new rules on how political staff can insinuate themselves into these kinds of negotiations. Look, those are good ideas, good reforms. But how did this all start? There was a lot of human error. You can blame the party in power. They've got to wear this. It's true. But one of the reasons this exploded in terms of costs and went into the billions of dollars in huge legal fees and paying off the private operator in Mississauga who borrowed money at 13% from a private equity group in the U.S. How did this happen? Because we privatized exclusively these new gas-fired power plants to take over from the coal plants that we were getting rid of. By privatizing it, by cutting out the old Big Bad Ontario Hydro, now OPG, Ontario Power Generation, the government exposed itself to a lot of risk. That there was a belief back then, shared by both the Liberals and the Tories, not the New Democrats, that the private sector could do this more efficiently. Well, in Mississauga, the private sector screwed up in a lot of ways. And in Oakville, the private sector didn't finesse it that well in terms of dealing with the local population, and didn't want to cite, for example, in other locations that might have been better, whether it was in Kitchener-Waterloo or Etobicoke, and ended up at that Ford plant for a variety of reasons. So by dealing in the private sector exclusively, the government of McGuinty and the government today have left themselves vulnerable to the private sector choosing sometimes the wrong sites, and then screaming bloody murder when the government has a change of heart because the politicians wake up to the problems.
I hear you, but then the private sector would come back and say, okay, let's do it your way. We'll have the public sector handle all of these things, and you get a Darlington nuclear reactor, which was supposed to cost $1.5 billion, ended up costing $16 billion. You like that any better?
That was a mess, which you, I think, know a lot better than I do, because I wasn't in the country at the time. But as I understand it, the government kept second guessing and redoing the plans.
Yep.
And so that's what happens when you redo. But that's my point. Governments always screw up in terms of their plans and their political will. When they do that, they don't get sued by Ontario Hydro or OPG when they screw up. If you believe that a new government, a new party in power won't screw up, then you should vote for them. If you believe, as I do, that they all tend to screw up one way or another, in good faith or sometimes in bad faith, then you leave yourselves that much more liable to having to compensate these companies for their lost profits, for their legal bills, for their 14% financing costs. It's crazy.
Tell me in our last 30 seconds here, why are we not having an election about this fall?
Well, there are some. That's more than 30 seconds. But in Ontario, the government decides when there's going to be a confidence motion. In Ottawa, and I believe most other provinces, the opposition in a minority government that we have now can gang up and call a confidence vote. In Ontario, just by the rules, the government has to decide, has to agree to that confidence motion, except when there's a budget or a speech from the throne. So we won't see that until next spring. And even then, I'm not sure that the NDP is willing to pull the plug on this government for pulling the plug on these hydro plants.
As we always say, we shall see. Martin Redcon, Toronto Star, thanks as always for coming into TVO tonight.
Pleasure.